My hope for this presentation is to give you a little overview of how Littoral Commander works if you have never played it. For those who have played it, I'll try to give some interesting tidbits of why certain mechanics work the way they do, and then also provide some of the research and analysis that went into creating the design for Littoral Commander. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat so I can hear them, and we'll happy to address them as I go.
Perfect.
All right, let's get
Okay.
started.
That's
So,
perfect. Okay.
for those who don't know who I am, my name is Sebastian Bae. I'm a senior game designer at CNA, which stands for the Center for Naval Analyses. We are a fairly funded think tank for the Navy and Marine Corps. So most of my day job is to actually design professional games for the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Army, and the wider Joint Force. I predominantly focus on Indo-Pacific security issues, operational warfighting, and sort of the future of warfare. I also teach a wargame design class at Georgetown, where my students will design educational games for sort of government sponsors. I previously taught at the U.S. Naval Academy and the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College. Um, One thing I will say, as someone affiliated with the government in some way, I have to put this disclaimer that all my opinions and views and Littoral Commander itself are products of my own work and do not represent the policies or views of our employer or any other associated institution. So, moving on. One thing I want to press on with was to provide three cases of educational wargaming in real life history, right? And particularly U.S. history. Um, One is actually a British example, which is the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WAT2. There's a great book about it, which is about the women who supported WAT2 in their analysis and also the educational gaming that trained British officers in the Navy during World War II to fight German U-boats. So you see the photo in the middle in the black and white. The women in the middle with the sticks are pointing at either submarine or British convoy escort positions on the ground that are marked with chalk and have little sort of like ship meeples, right? And each of the officers who are commanding the ships are looking through a slot in the cloth that can only represent their vision of view on the ocean, and they would relay orders to the Wrens, who are the female British officers, who would execute them according to the game's rules. These games, both analytical and educational, help the British sort of win the Battle of Atlantic, along with other factors. But it was one of the factors. A little before then, prior to World War II, the U.S. Naval War College here in Newport, Rhode Island, in the States, had actually a series of games: Duel, Fleet, Tactical, and Strategic. These were three different types of games, mostly looking at naval warfare at different echelons. Duel, as one could mention, was like a ship-on-ship battle. This was often played on like giant chalkboards on tables, so very similar to the method that the WOT2 game used. Fleet Tactical was much bigger and was often shifted to large chalkboards or even floors, as you sort of see in Pringle Hall in 1950 on the top right-hand corner. And then Strategic was a game about multiple fleets engaging across a theater, right? Um, some of the great admirals of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, like Spruance, Nimitz, and so forth, all went through this course and played these games. These games were educational to allow them to look at different navies and different geographies and different problems. Um, this is where the Plan Orange games were played for educational purposes. Uh, One thing I will say is that the Navy that the U.S. Navy played against the most during their war college years was actually Plan Red, which is the British Navy. And then the last example I'll give is the U.S. Marine Corps' family of games called TAC War, which were a series of 4 games: TAC War, Steel Thrust, Landing Force, Warfare. And these games were at like the Naval War College games, tiered in echelon. TAC War focused really on the battalion and company level, so that's the photo you see in 1986 over there. The things hanging above are actually orders that are hanging over this sort of pipe across the map. So think miniatures maps with little figurines with for vehicles and so forth, and they're trying to read orders of where they should and should be not going. Steel Thrust sort of resembled this, but was more separated and more focused on staffs. And Landing Force and Warfare, as they moved up the echelon, looked more like command post exercises, training for staffs to be able to execute orders and compete against another adversary, either control or another staff, as they issue orders and try to synthesize information. So, moving on to my game itself, the Littoral Commander is designed for about 2 to 6 people. Um, and you can have more people than that, but usually that's about the right number. It is designed to look at the future warfare, so it projects out to about 2030 and beyond, right? Looking at sort of what the Marine Corps calls Force Design 2030 and Expeditionary Advanced Basing Operations, or EABO, which is also increasingly called the Stand-in Force, or the SIF. The game is published by the Dietz Foundation, which is a non-profit educational game publisher. And the game fundamentally asks is how can Marines within a contested environment fight against peer adversaries in different scenarios? And the game fundamentally wants four things for the players. One is to force them to actively plan and coordinate in teams, operate within multi-domain or all-domain contested environments. So, like, you have to think about cyber, logistics, underwater warfare, from aircraft to, long-range fires. Consider logistics constraints, mostly what we call class 5, which is munitions, and then leverage capabilities across the joint force in terms of sequencing and what we call convergence. One of my favorite photos of ever of Littoral Commander is the right-hand photo. Is actually a bunch of enlisted NCOs, non-commissioned officers, playing Littoral Commander as part of their capstone, as part of their College of Enlisted Military Education, or CME, is where young, not young, but experienced NCOs will go to get training to either become staff sergeants or gunnies or gunnery sergeants. So that is CME has been using Littoral Commander for several years now, and I'm super excited about it as a former sergeant myself. So it's really great to see. So this picture collage is to give you a sense of where Littoral Commander has been and sort of is going. The top left-hand photo is actually a photo from someone's Twitter when they shared it to me about their playing. I think this was from Japan. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then the far right one on the top hand corner is actually from a trip recently in the summer to Venice, where we ran it for the the Italian Command Staff College in Venice for several days as part of a wider wargaming education process. And the top left hand corner is Command Staff College at Fort Leavenworth for the U.S. Army. So they're planning the Littoral Commander to also look at sort of the future of warfare, tactical decision making, and so forth. And then the bottom right hand photo is actually a recent photo, just less than a week old, which is of the upcoming draft version of Littoral Commander Australia, which is part of a wider effort to expand the forces inside Littoral Commander, because currently it is only the PRC, the China, and the US forces. So we're trying to include various forces, including Spain, Germany, the UK, um, the Swedes, Australia, Japan, um, and Korea. So those are all things that are in the works in various levels of completion. But Australia is one of the ones that is closest to being finished, because they have been working on it with me for quite a bit, and it is led by Robert Egnan and Scott Jenkinson over at the Australian Defence Force. So, any questions? Is that a question?
Okay, any question around? Hello. Okay, we have Daniel here. When you present your work with wargame design for educational purpose, do you adjust it specifically to each audience or target, marine, air, or other option, even if it's the same game?
Yeah, no, great question. And the answer is yes. A lot of times, one of the first conversations I will have when I'm presenting about education wargaming or using one of my own games or any game for audience, I will always ask what are the TLOs? What are the training and learning objectives, right? Like, what do you want your players to think about, right? So whether it's using Littoral Commander, right? So let's say Daniel says, hey, can you run a game for my officers? I was like, okay, what do you want them to learn? Like, what do you want them to focus on? And he may say, hey, we're a logistics unit, so we may want to focus on logistics constraints and different ways to supply. I'm like, okay, that's great. Let's play a scenario where Marines are trapped on an island and your job is to keep them supplied, like all the different ways to keep them supplied. And the adversary is blockading them or stopping them, or, you know what I mean, trying to do counter air to stop your resupply by air, right? Right. So, like, you have to tailor whatever scenario or whatever lesson you're trying to drive in, whether it's service specific, right? Whether it's like a heavy air component or a heavy long range fires component. But the goal is to make sure they're focusing on the right set of decisions and interactions and consequences.
Good.
Any other
Okay.
questions?
Anyone? Andrea is writing. Any question? Any question? So I have a
No?
question. Just
Yep.
do you usually play test the game with wargamers, people that is not used to play war games, like people for educational purpose, military people, and so on. So how do you manage to play test your games?
Oh, I would say the vast majority of the people that we play with are not war gamers because they're
Okay.
often military officers, and maybe 1 in 10 is like a board game person, right?
Okay.
So like almost everyone in that photo, in the Italian photo,
Yes.
um, never played a board game, and
Okay.
this was their first time. So it's always so you always have to learn how to take it real slow, right? Um, that's why if you see another photo, the woman in sort of the gray sweater, Rachel, she's one of my colleagues was helping me. So like I bring help, make sure there's a higher degree of facilitator to player ratio to allow them to learn and get eased into learning the board game mechanic portion. I will also say that I will teach the game differently, not in terms of changing the rules, but the language I use when I teach board game people
Yeah.
to when I teach like sort of, you know what I mean, uh, professional military officers or
Okay.
enlisted leaders because I'll try to put them in terms in which they understand. So I was instead of saying, "Hey, we're using sort of like if I use like a board game community, I was like, hey, we're gonna have a sort of card-driven mechanic where you play cards as special effects, and we're gonna have like a bucket of dice, and whoever has the most like produce that many hits, kind of thing, right? For most war gamers, they'll understand what that means because there's a
Yes.
language coded element to it. I won't say that to a lot of room full of military officers. I'll say I'm like, hey, we're gonna focus on F2T2 EA, which is find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess. That's what the game is about. So think about it in that terms, right? We're gonna think about how many leakers, which is a term in which you get past air defense. Like you'll fire a bunch of missiles, they'll fire a bunch of defensive missiles, and we'll focus on leakers, right? That's how many hits you'll get, right? So sometimes just coding the language in which they're learning the game and understanding the game a little bit differently, so you can root it into their own knowledge. Because often it can just feel like a big strange thing. But great question.
Thank you. So, okay, Andrea has a question and we can pass for the second block. So, do you think the outcome of recent Taiwan events was strongly analyzed with war games?
What Taiwan event? You got to be a little bit more specific.
The Taiwan event, Andrea, any more specific? Okay.
While they're writing that, I would say most games
Okay,
don't.
it's just
Uh,
China
uh,
attacking back to Taiwan.
Oh yeah. So there is a scenario in the game called Beachhead, which looks at that where like the first wave of the PRC forces are trying to land on Taiwan. There's a small contingent of, which is actually the scenario you see in the top left-hand corner, right?
Okay.
Um, and I would say lots of professional war games look at that scenario. A lot of other people who work in the unclassified think tank world also look at it. So with varying degrees of uh, bias and angle and so forth. So um, I would also say it's always hard to get everything right when you're looking at operational warfare at that level, right? Uh, Littoral Commander only looks at very small slices of it, right, in time, and even then it misses stuff. right? And there's abstraction and so forth. But imagine like brigades and divisions that you have to consider over multiple time, right? So like when you play a game about D-Day or Normandy or Operation Husky in World War II, like you're moving lots of people, right? And even those games simplify lots of those factors away, make it easier for players to understand. So there's always caveats of what kind of game you produce and what kind of analysis that game can give you. Great question.
Thank you. We,
Um,
we can pass for the next thing.
yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I'll give a quick overview of how Littoral Commander is played, and I won't dive too much into the details unless someone is like specifically wants to ask a question about a mechanic, because this isn't a teach and play as much as like an overview of how the game works. So the game is broken into 5 stages, and for those who've seen this player aid, this is actually the new player aid graphics that are from the new upcoming Baltic version. So it is 5 stages, right? Planning and deployment are essentially the steps that often precede most of the turns. They only occur either on the first or designated turn. So like planning is where you get your cards using what we call command points. You get to choose whatever cards you want. You get to see the deck. This represents the planning portion where if you're an officer or you're part of a staff, you wouldn't randomly draw capabilities. You would make a plan, right? And this is where you get to do this with your teammates. Deployment is when you get to deploy all your units according to your plan, right? Put them in certain boxes. The scenario will say like you must deploy all ground units within 3 hexes of G9, right? When all of that is done, right, you'll go into the vast majority of the game, which is an action, initiative, and victory. Action is where 90% of the game happens, right? Where each of the players will take turns or impulses, right, within the turn, right? So if I am a player, when I do my action, it is my impulse, and then when Daniel does his turn or Sergio does their actions, they're doing their impulse, right?
Okay.
And then after all those impulses have been done in the action stage, we move to initiative, which is when we check if anyone has shifted initiative. And then we check if anyone has won. If no one has won, we go back to action. In certain cases, we'll go back to planning and get new cards in certain turns of the scenario. So some of the scenarios will say on turns 2, 4, 5, and 6, get new cards and have a planning stage, right? So you'll do that sometimes to get new cards and sort of be allowed to adapt. Um, so that's generally how the form of the game works. One thing I will say is how to read our counters is sort of important with any game, right? The most important factors are the name, which is the designator, which is like 1-1 Bravo. So all the units are given sort of generic unit designations. So like 1-1 Bravo and 1-2 Bravo, they're all sort of part of the same company, Bravo company. The top right-hand corner is what we call movement points, or MP. Our map is colored and coded, so like you have to spend a certain number of movement points to enter a hex. So that one, for example, can enter 3 hexes that are 1 point each, right? Or go into 2, then 1. The combat values are only 3 on most counters, which is ground assault, which is fighting in the same hex, sort of close combat. Long range strike, which represents everything from missiles to rockets to suicide drones that are long range. Interception refers to integrated air and missile defense that shoots down all those things that are long range strike. And then we have resupply units. The big number, this number or 8 here, right, is what you need to your combat value is what you need to roll equal or less than. That is a mechanic that screws with some people, uh, but that is the value you need equal and less than. So if you roll a 7, roll a 6, you get hits. Um, if the exponent number or the superscript is the range, so if it says 0, it means it has to be in the same hex to attack. So this red value here for long range strike, you hit on 1 through 8, those are successes, and then you have a hex range of 9 where I can shoot out that far, right? Our hexes represent 20 kilometers wide, which is significant distance for a tactical game. But given the range of long-range missiles, we had to make the hexes quite substantial to make any of these weapons have any kind of differential value, right? When we originally had like 5 kilometer hexes, everything could shoot everything, right? So like there was no difference between a tomahawk missile to a mortar to artillery. It was almost negligible, right? So there was no point. So we had to increase the hex distances to highlight some of those distances. Um, and this is a new graphic that we created for the Baltic to help people understand all sort of how the game is, sort of seeded. So we talked about this first layer, which is about planning, deployment, action, initiative, and victory. And then we have each of the impulses. So player 1, player 2 will go, and then player 3, and so forth, all the way down in a 6-player game. And within each of those impulse, you have sort of a rough order. One thing I say is that why I say it's a rough order is because the game frustratingly to some people, has a lot of flexibility and bend to the design, right? You don't have to do things in a very rigid way, right? So, for example, if you want to move, then fight, you can. But if you're like, I'm gonna shoot my missile, then move away, you can do that too. So there's no like strict sequence. There's only certain sets of certain things that happen at certain times that you have to do, and everything else in between is very flexible. So one of the first things you have to do is you have to activate units and stacks. So with core actions, so you have to designate what core actions you're doing. And the last thing is that um, at any point in your impulse, you have to adjudicate all combat at the same time, right? All combat has to be declared, and you say, hey, that's all the combat I'm declaring, and then you'll adjudicate those. Um, those are the only two things within an impulse that have to happen at particular times or in a particular way. Everything else can be moved. Like, for example, even in our example, let's say you want to use persistent JCC effects, right? Depending on those effects, you probably most likely want them to do before you do combat. But let's say you want to prepare something for your next teammate, and you may want to use that at the very end, and you can, and the game allows you to do that. And even in adjudicating combat, like you know what I mean, if there's a complex set of things, right? You can decide as the attacker really how that sequence happens. But this is sort of the logical order that often most combat is adjudicated, and we often offer this structure as a guide, but not as a requirement, right? Is that a question?
I'm just
So
leaving. I'm just leaving a
yeah.
message to the people. So if they want to make a question in Spanish, I can just translate you. So if just
Oh, perfect.
exactly. So if anyone has any question, just leave it in the chat, and I will ask him. Okay. Okay,
All right.
Sebastian, is yours.
Yeah, so another quick thing is that our 4 core actions, there are technically 5 now in Baltic, um, but 4 is essentially move in combat, move and conceal, play a joint capability card, essentially a special effect, right? And then move and conduct a resupply. The game is super simple in that regard. You can only do these 4 things, or now 5 in Baltic. But moving combat is essentially how you engage in combat for anything. Long range strike, ground combat, submarine warfare, does not matter. That's how you do it. One of the key things for most combat is that you must reveal your target, right? So those chits must be like sort of flipped over where I can see the face of it. So for me to strike it, right? That's the whole purpose of how do I find things? How do I search for things? How do I make sure, like, remember where things were before when they hide again? So I know I'm searching for the right ship or right missile or launcher that I'm looking for. You can conceal or flip your counter back down where you hide the face of your unit, which is the move and conceal portion. This represents that you are trying to actively hide, right, your signature, your physical presence from active sensors. The capability cards or JCCs are where I hide as the designer all this complexity, where we have all sorts of like effects from engineers to drones to cyber effects, electronic warfare, everything and anything you could think of to future capabilities, like things that we don't even use yet, like AI capabilities and so forth, hypersonic weapons. And we allow our players to sort of think about like the future of warfare in that way. And then obviously to conduct resupply for combat, right? To give those combat values supply, because you cannot conduct combat of any kind without supply, right? The cards are where we hide a lot of the complexity from everything from different types of missiles and so forth. And they really come in five broad sort of categories, right? Of sort of like fires, maneuver, interception, information operations, and what we call C5 ISR, which is command and control, really, right? Um, they have broad like bins of things they can do, like characteristics they'll have. Like some are persistent, some are attached to straight units directly on the on the map. Like engineers will be directly attached to a unit, right? So whatever that unit now can do an engineering action, right? Um, Two of my favorite cards um, are the tactical network cards, where you see in the bottom left, because they are required for both teams. Both teams have the same exact card, the tactical network card, which it represents all the digital networks. Like think of like all the digital infrastructure that allows us to do modern combat. So like comms gear, transmitting fire data, transmitting and correlating tracks, right, for aircraft or targets. That is all wrapped up in this card. And as you do cyber or electronic warfare, you can degrade these networks for the whole team of your opposing side. That means their combat values go down for long range strike and interception. So it is incredibly painful, but an incredibly important dimension of modern warfare that I really want to include. And it's probably the one really super cool, like original thing in my game that I mean, I haven't seen in other games playing war games, having that sort of network infrastructure be a key component of the game. Um, so these are some examples, right, of how cards are played. Like for example, someone can play the tactical cyber card, right, and I can respond with a defense or nullify action by a tactical cyber defense. I will roll for my cyber defense. If it's successful, I will just discard his cyber attack. If I fail, then the person just gets to roll for their effect as if I just failed and I don't get to stop them, right? So that's a sort of way we represent some of the cyber or EW actions. That's same thing for electronic warfare. The cyber effects can range vastly from the type of effects that you give, from revealing units, paralyzing units, you're adding cubes, degradation cubes on the tactical network cards, to seeing your hand, all sorts of wild effects. And then aircrafts are sort of similar, right? Sort of like Deep Strike is a card that the US has, and they'll say they're, in this case, attacking the Russians, one Anna, right? Then the Russian player can play their combat air patrol, which is a fighter nullifier, or which can respond to enemy action with aircraft. And I would roll and try to detect first, try to detect, then roll to nullify it. If they survive, then they just proceed to attack one Anna, just like they normally would with anything, right? But that's sort of the card play dynamic. These are some very simple examples. You can end up having chains of like responses where like I'm trying to shoot your F-22, right, with my Russian felon, and then you have another aircraft. You have F-35s trying to chase my felon down first before I shoot down your F-22, and I may have another felon trying to chase the F-35. So you just sort of adjudicate those from the backwards, from the back end of the chain all the way to the front, right? So it can get a little complex, but it makes for interesting sort of tactical dilemmas. Um, I'll pause here before I jump into like sort of the things that the game research went into. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question from Daniel. He says
Mm.
a technology probably represented in cards can be improved or even degrade through the game.
Actually, no, but that's a great idea. So only the things, so some cards can be degraded because they'll have long range strike values, and they'll be also affected by your tactical network card. So if you're degraded in your tactical network card, your bomber will also be degraded. But they cannot be improved in the sense of like getting better. But that's a good question. Actually, no, that's a lie. Some cards like Gator can improve combat values of other cards, or like what is it? The Growler. will give aviation friendly aviation cards better value. So yes, yeah, actually we can. There's so many cards in my head that it's hard to keep track of them all. Um, but yeah, so some of like you can chain cards of effects together to make them better, and they're sort of specifically designed that way. So like a growler is meant to go out with a combat air fighter, right? An air-to-air fighter like a F-22, F-35, right? And we reward people who do that, but it also costs lots of points to do that, right? Um, I don't think I see any other questions, but the foundational, like key mechanic, and please feel free to put more questions. I'll stop as we go.
Yep.
Is what we call F2T2EA. I mentioned it earlier. The graphic on the far right hand side is a good example, right? So in the military, we say as you're trying to find targets. It's not just like, hey, I see this person and I shoot it, right? It's you go through this process of like, hey, I find a general location and I fix it to a very specific location, right? I'm tracking it as I'm like live tracking it, right? So the best way to example is like, hey, I know you're in Madrid, right? In some portion of Madrid, I found you, right? That's the find, right? I fixed you means I have fixed your location to a corner, right? And I can see you, sort of kind of thing, right? Whether with a sensor or camera or whatever, right? And tracking means like as you're walking down the street in Madrid, I can track you along the way, right? And that allows me to move to targeting. I can now target you with a munition, a cyber effect, or something else. And the engage portion is when I do that, right? And then assessing is what we call battle damage assessment, or BDA, is when I assess if I have done damage to you, right? Or what kind of damage. Did I hit your radar? Did I hit your car? Did I hit your blah, 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 right? So that is the foundational schema that our players are fundamentally cycling through throughout the game. So like the game, for example, simplify some of this, right? So like when you play a card or a satellite to reveal something, you do the whole find, fix, track portion, right? And when you do your actions and trying to um, commit a uh, combat action or try to do a sequence of complex like JCCs, you're doing the target engagement portion, right? The TE portion, right? We originally had a assess portion where you had to assess um, how good you did, or like you don't know exactly how many hits you did or how damaged a ship is. People hated it, like they hated it so much we've removed it. But one thing I will say is that if you play on Vassal, right, and you the Vassal module doesn't allow you to peek into other people's like hands where they have their unit tracker. So you, unless like literally I was play testing a scenario last night with a couple colleagues in Australia, and I was writing down notes of like, oh, okay, I successfully hit this ship once. So later on, if I see that ship again, I know I hit them once already, and I can like measure how much missiles I'm gonna fire, right? So, but there was a point that I took bad notes, and I was like, oh man, I can't read my own handwriting. So it sort of messed with some of my decision making there. But those are some of the elements of the assess portion that can still work in the game rules, like if you use it in a different way, like Vassal, or if you hide the unit trackers behind the screen and so forth, right? Um, One of the questions says, "What are the main changes to
Yep.
the rules introduced in Baltic versus the previous Indo-Pacific?" That's a big question. I would say the major addition is what we call the space mechanic, right? So, if for those who have played Littoral Commander, one of the things I was super dissatisfied with was like how units were transported, either from ship to shore or from plane to the ground and so forth. And it would say like a JCC would say like a C-130 will say like you can move a company or two or four platoons, right? Which sort of works, right? But not always, because some platoons are bigger than others. Like a platoon of air defense, right, is way bigger than a platoon of infantry, right? But that was our way to like get around like the simplicity aspect of the cards, right? But one of the first things we wanted to do was fix that, right? And also given the type of unit, which is the Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is the units on ships, that is the focus of Baltic and not the Marine Littoral Regiment. We want to absolutely fix that. So we gave all units space value, like how much space on a ship, on a plane do they take up, right? Is it one? Is it two? Is it three? Regardless of what size of unit, like echelon you are. So, like for example, a HIMARS section may be bigger in space than an infantry platoon, right? Which is often the case, right? Because a HIMARS section will have radars and sensors and all these other things that are big and chunky, right? And ammo, right? So that's one thing. So all the units will have space values. It doesn't really affect things until you get to embarkation and disembarkation, which is some ships will have embarkation values of how much space can you put on it, right? This represents the amphibious ships like, you know what I mean, the LHDs, right, or the LPDs or LSTs, right? They will have space values of saying, I have 10 GPSV or general purpose space value, and they'll have 10 aviation space, right? So those are the two types of space values you can have, right? Which are marked on unit trackers. And then you can say, hey, this ship has, I can fit 10, GPSV, so I can put on, let's say, 10 platoons on the ship, each costing one. Cool, excellent, right? Or I can put in 5 sections of HIMARS because that they each take up 2, right? So it gives you a lot more flexibility, but still keeping that constraint around it, right? Some of the JCCs will do the same. So C-130 will say, I can unload or introduce 6 GPSV worth of units into airfield. Doesn't tell you what kind. It can be literally 3 units or 1 unit, whatever, right? Depending on how much your main space they take up. Um, and then there's like different ways to disembark from amphibious ships or embark capable ships to shore, either by helo, by ship to shore connectors, and by port. But those are pretty niche rules, but they take up huge sections of the rule book to explain, such as the case. But I would say most of the rules are just clarifications and addition things that we want to clarify from the first edition. But those are the big 2 things, and one addition of a core rule set, a core action, which is to move and do an embarked JCC, right? Persistent JCC, because like embarked units, or for example, uh, LA, U.S. Marine Corps LHD can have embarked fighter craft, right? And they'll say they're embarked, right? Onto a card just like you're sort of attached, right? So I can use that now. Like, you know what I mean? It's a sort of separate action, but functionally works very similar to how you would use a persistent JCC or attachment, right? But because the way we categorize embarked cards as different than those, we had to make a core action to allow people to do that. When do I expect LP being ready to I think it's being shipped already. I got my box of author copies just last night coming home from work. So I already know some people have received theirs. A colleague of mine in Okinawa just got theirs last night and sent me a photo. So they should be on their way if you ordered the latest printing. If you want copies, I would highly recommend ordering them because our publisher buys small batches. Um, so like usually like 800 copies in a batch. So like if you want a copy, I would recommend getting one like quickly because they usually go out pretty quickly. Baltic is about to arrive, I think January. January, and our factory proof is coming next week, Thursday or something. Um, and then will there be a new release of Indo-Pacific cars to reflect these changes? Yes, the answer is yes. So I'm currently working on an edition update for Littoral Commander, which will include like all the changes to align it to Baltic, um, to make sure they're the same rule set. And I was working on that last night actually, to make sure like the cars are ready, the way the language works in the rule book and so forth. So yes, there will be like a full true edition update to Littoral Commander Indo-Pacific. The maps will look a little different as well. Um, they'll sort of be hollow so you can see the terrain underneath of it and so forth. Um, and yeah, you can find the Baltic rules set on BGG that I posted probably a month ago or more. But there are a couple changes, and my hope before we get to the national expansions is to make Baltic, as Baltic comes out, is to make the Littoral Commander Indo-Pacific version align with Baltic, so they serve as stable core portions of the series, and the expansions just build off those core rules, right? Yeah. Great questions all around. All right. Um,
Good.
all right, cool. One of the things I will say is people always ask me how did I come up with like the math?
Yes.
And this is how. If you have not read Fleet Tactics by Wayne Hughes, I highly recommend it. It is the basis for our combat engine. So if you are intimidated by the map on the left-hand side, the best way, and you're a former enlisted infantry guy can understand it. So the best way to understand it is the number of offensive missiles minus, or the power of offensive missiles minus the defensive power, right? Applied to endurance power. That's the sort of equation that Salvo equations fundamentally work off of, right? Is how many how much is your offensive power, and I'll deduct from that my of defensive power, my ability to intercept, right? And that will be applied to my endurance power, which is like how many hits can I take, right? This is essentially his notion of Salvo equations, right? And this is essentially how Littoral Commander's engine works, which is offensive dice, right? A successful number, and there's minus from that your successful intercept dice, and then that equals your number of hits, and your hit points are your endurance power, right? One thing I will say is that when we were grading these, we had to do a bunch of math to discover like what is the CEP for things, or circular error probability, and like how much is like certain warheads are bigger than others on certain missiles and so forth. But some weapons have like, or hypersonics, we don't have examples of how much that technical data is in the unclass realm. So we have to use a technique called benchmarking, which is something I will talk about later, but is essentially when we took two really known points of data, or multiple points of data, and be like, hey, relative to these data points, where is this thing, right? Is it better in terms of PK? Does it mean that it needs to roll more dice because it has lots more like explosive power, right? Or warheads and so forth. So that is how we did a lot of the sort of long range fires calculation for using Salvo equations found in Wayne Hughes. Uh, for the ground combat is actually just pulled from Trevor Dupui's work on like military operations, and like sort of like his understanding of how combat power works at the ground level, which essentially is a mathematical way of essentially scoring every single weapon in a formation and giving an aggregate score, and then comparing that on a scale of how many casualties it would inflict, right? So that's how we essentially graded or created probabilities of kill for units that would produce um, peak hits, right? So like this is why some units will have 6, most units will have 4, some will have 8, and so forth. It's fundamentally a hardware capabilities driven assessment of combat effectiveness. Um, so one thing I will note here is that that's one of the weaknesses of the way we approach our game design, is it does not consider morale or leadership or any of those soft qualitative elements that are really important in combat. Um, that was purposeful because we want them to focus on sort of the um, hardware component of future warfare, right? Understanding capabilities, understanding missile ranges, and so forth. But the other portion was when we added the qualitative element to it, it got a little too complex for some of our players. Probably will be okay for like a hobby game, as people know game mechanics more and are easier accessible. But as we played more and more with some of our key military audiences, it, all the little things we had to decide that we really loved, we also got rid of at times to sort of strip down to the core things that we want to focus on. So if you ask us how we did the terrain analysis for the game, it is complex and is largely thanks to a colleague of mine who helped me on this for the maps and led the map design and the map analysis was Matt Kramer. Out and he is currently working on new updated versions for the maps and stuff with some better data. One is essentially we took each map and we had ArcGIS give it a score, right? And the way we did that score is essentially took elevation. Um, I took rasta, which is essentially land cover, right? Like, is there forest, or there whatever? Like, you know what I mean? What is the density of like sort of vegetation on the ground? And then infrastructure, and then balometry, which is essentially the depth of water. And then we took all those 4 factors and that data set, and we said, hey, in each of these 20-kilometer hexes, give it a score, and we scored each hex from 1 through 5, right? Of how easy it would be for a wheeled vehicle to traverse that area. It is not a perfect way. We have found like errors sometimes when we had to manually check hexes. Like Mac, God bless his heart, like would check every hex that each of the hexes were right, right? Like he would like look at satellite images and be like, "Hey, he's like, is this did the computer do a right job?" And he'll spot check areas on the map. Um, and that allowed, or we would send out these maps for like subject matter a review by people who live in the area. Like we did that with Baltic, right? And they're like, "Hey, you missed this thing," or "Hey, like there's actually this road that exists that is actually really crappy. So is that not a one? It's probably like a two or three kind of thing, right?" So we did a lot of research and math and analysis behind why certain hexes are the way they are. But one thing I will say is they're still fundamentally abstractions, right? About how fast a tactical unit could move through that, right? It's not a question of how fast a car can move through it, right? It's a question of how fast can a tactical unit move in formation across that hex, right? So this is something very important and a nuance that's really important. Um, and one thing I will say is the game is fundamentally about like in war games in general about context, right? When we play a game, right, it's about the when, the why, and the how. Why do we make certain choices? When do we make those choices? And how do we implement our plans, right? And one thing I wanted to do for the players that play the Littoral Commander was to have them understand military capabilities contextually and how to apply them in specific sequences and against specific problems in specific ways that can be coordinated across each other's teams. Like, for example, uh, capabilities that are great for the Luzon map, right? Maybe really big ranges, right? May not be as useful for a map like the this Straits of Malacca, right? Where you're fighting like, as some people have described it, fighting a knife fight in a phone booth, right? It's range is not the thing you're looking for, is volume, right? Right? So forth like that, right? So they're in different contexts, different capabilities and different strategies and tactics are required to win. So this is my like sort of like proud moment as the Littoral Commander like designer, which is when we got to talk with Commandant Smith, who is the head of the U.S. Marine Corps right now. At the top leadership, he's our 4-star in the Marine Corps, and he came by the table and we discussed it. And I got to brief on sort of what we're doing and how the game came to be, and it was really quite awesome. So this is my little, and I wish I knew he was coming so I could wear at least a better Hawaiian shirt. I would still probably wear a Hawaiian shirt, but I'll at least wear a better one. If you want to reach out to me, my email is on the right hand side. If you are still on Twitter, I have Twitter still, but I'm more and more active on Blue Sky as well, which is the same. All right. Any other questions?
Okay. Any question, people? Well, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for this presentation. It's really, really, really nice. Really nice. It's just so interesting to see how the game has been developed, how the game has been just raised for nothing because there is nothing before that. This is your first game, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is my first commercial game. Yeah.
Okay, so it's really nice. And I have a question for you. You
hmm
have been talking about the multiplayer, so the sites. Is the game working as a team? So the player has to work as a team, and they have to take decision over their options, or is just like a true multiplayer?
No, yeah. So you play as a team. So like, let's
Okay,
say you and I are a team, and then Daniel and Benito are a team, right?
okay.
So we win as a team, right? But one thing I will say is that teams are not always aligned in what they think their team should be doing, which creates this tension, which is good because that's how real staffs work. And we want people to have that team element. And that's something I didn't want to get rid of. And it's really good for teaching, right? Because you get someone to like talk to about your plan and be like, "Hey, Sergio, like, what do you think we should be doing?" And even yesterday when we were playtesting this scenario for the Okinawa map, the team who are like defense military professionals were arguing about what cards to pick. They're like, no, 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 this is what we need to do. No, like, no, 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 no. I think this is important, right?
Okay.
So it's really interesting to have that conversation, and it's great to have like little teams to have those discussions. One thing I've also noticed, which is done by pure accident, is that when you have teams like that, it helps to have someone like if someone is good at games, right? They're able to like coach the other person through the mechanics of like, oh, like let's do this, or like just how that works, right? So it lowers the bar for someone who's not a gamer to understand the game, which is always good. But one thing I would give as a warning as a teacher portion of teaching this game is always beware of any kind of team game where one person tries to run the whole game, right? It's no longer fun for that person, right? So we have all played like games like Pandemic or something where
Yeah,
one person's
exactly.
like controlling everyone's
Yes.
actions, right? And I as a facilitator make sure not to let that happen, right? So I'm like, hey, no, no, like you get to make the decision, right? Right? Like you get to make this. You can ask for advice, you can listen to them, but ultimately, I need you to decide. Tell me how many dice you're using to fire how many missiles against what target. Like that is your decision. You get to own that, and that is also sometimes scary for some people, right? But it is really important for those people to have those kind of experiences to get that uncertainty and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have some messages in the chat. Just
Mhm.
Claudio is just writing you something because he's having some problem finding tutor to help me progress properly in my thesis. So if you have any contact, you can Claudio write Sebastian to the email address or something, just in case Sebastian could help you.
Yeah,
Uh,
shoot me an email.
Great. So yes, I have your email also, but I will try to put in the chat. Well, Benito, just really great presentation. Agree, completely agree. Why the Chinese units have worse movement allowance than the US units? Carlos Martin question.
Oh yeah, so the reason why Chinese units have worse movement is a little complicated. One is that they move less as single unit, like small breakdown units, right? In their doctrine, and honestly, their chassis are terrible. Like the chassis that allow their tactical vehicles, which is a Type 05, is a pretty shitty vehicle, to be honest. And that's one of the reasons, right? And yeah, that's yeah. Those are predominantly the two reasons why we gave them less movement points, right? Is that they tend to cluster together more naturally as they try to have smaller command and control distances between units, which makes them move slower from observations of their exercises. And then the other thing is that they're like the chassis that a lot of their tactical vehicles are built on is pretty bad. Um, yeah.
Okay, fantastic presentation. Well, your email, thank you, thank you. For me also, thank you. If anyone just come to the stage to ask something and speak directly with Sebastian, you can raise your hand. If not, I'm just doing just thank you, Sebastian, for coming to this convention. It's really a pleasure to have you here. The game is just having a lot of attention in Spain. There is a lot of clubs and a lot of people in convention, in physical convention, that is just playing the game, and it has a really successful market and selling things. So just the next game, if I don't mistake, is just the expansion Australia, and next one is Baltic, right?
Baltic, and then Australia will probably be one of
Okay,
the first expansions along with Japan.
okay,
Will probably come out late, probably early 26, honestly, to be frank. Um, Either late 25 or early 26.
okay.
Baltic will ship out in January, and that's out of my hands. It's just printing and shipping and so forth. But one thing I will say is
Yeah.
I've been surprised. Like I was like, I was very proud of Littoral Commander when I was designing it, but I was really surprised of like people like wanting to play it for fun, right? In the sense of like I made like there are parts of that game that I could have made more fun and easier, but I kept it hard and difficult for the educational value, right? And even some publishers who I originally was pitching this game to, like, wanted to get rid of those things, right? They're like, "Hey, we need to make it more fun, or more easy," right? I was like, but the thing you're trying to get rid of is really important for education, right? And I won't give it up, right? Um, and so like I know the game is not the easiest um game to play at times, right? Um, but at the same time, I'm always surprised by like seeing people like play it. Like I was at different gaming conventions and I'll see people play it once, and which was a surprise because I was like, "Holy shit! Like you brought that and you're setting that up all by yourself, right? And you found like five other people to want to play that game with
That's
you."
it.
Right? I'm like, "That's cool." So that's always really surprising, and I've also been surprised by how much other people in other countries have been really interested. So Australia w- was one of the first countries to approach me and ask like, can we make an Australia version of it? Um, and then we were like, yeah, let's collaborate. Let's try to make an Australia version. And other people want to work one. So we're working with a colleague of ours in the Spanish Navy to help us build a Spanish version. Um, he's play testing already copies of it, and you know what I mean, if you're on my Twitter, you've probably seen a picture of him doing it. So we're working with our German colleagues, our British colleagues, and so forth to build out expansions. So like one of the things I want to see is like a British player playing a British Navy unit in the Baltic, supporting a US player who's playing the US Marine Corps. Like that would be really cool because those are different capabilities, different cards they bring, and so forth like that. It'll be even better if it's like three different nations, like on a team of three, versus uh, a different coalition on the other side, right? So I think that'll be really interesting.
Good. Well, just the last question here is just Andrea, just telling if you have any question, any lesson that you shared in the past, anything in YouTube, anything in just in a website that people can check it out.
Oh yeah, so I guess my one lesson for everyone who wants to run this game for educational purposes, or just for other military historians or people who are really interested is um, make sure the discussion after the game is really important, right? Like, uh, one of the things I say is like, for educational gaming, the learning happens during the game, but like the synthesis, the sinking in portion of learning happens when after you talk, right? So one of my favorite parts is not only playing Littoral Commander with people and seeing them learn and seeing that light bulb click, right? But also the moment where we have that conversation and we're like, okay, let's spend like 30, 40 minutes to replay the game and just talk about what we learned, right? Like, what did you think was important? What mistake would you correct? And those are really important elements of having a good educational gaming experience, right? And you know what I mean, as Andrea has mentioned, Beyond Solitaire is a great podcast. I've been on those. And one of the other lessons I will say is that I'm always intrigued by how people are creative, right? Like one a perfect example. One of the things that people always want to ask me for as the designer is like, can you give recommended JCCs for different scenarios? And I have been adamant, right, of saying no. I was like, nope, I will not give you like cards that you should pick. And I understand why people ask for it because there are a lot of cards. There are 112 cards per team that you have to look through the first time you play, and that is overwhelming. I totally empathize. But one of the things I've learned by running this game dozens and dozens and dozens of different times for different people and different demographics is I'm always surprised by the cards that people use, and sometimes, right? And they think of them using them in interesting ways. And that's the thing I don't want to lose, right? And I don't want to give people like I don't want to hem people's thinking, right? Um, about how to use cards or how to use a certain tactic, of saying like, hey, sort of this is the right answer. And that's something I've quickly resisted throughout, and I've still resisted. So you will still not find those in Baltic if you're like, hoping that you'll get those, nor in any of the other expansions. Um, and I want people to sort of experiment and explore through the game. And I know someone asked me, could you share a few words about one choice development approach? Could you explain that? I'm not quite sure what you mean. Um, Someone says, choosing cards is the funniest part, especially when the game moves in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
Exactly. That is one of the things I love about the game, and I don't want people to lose that. And sometimes it is hilarious, and sometimes it is devastating, and you just have to choose better next time. Uh, how were you able to maintain one choice approach while adding depth and Baltic? Um, I would say one of the hard things for Baltic was to resist the urge to add things. Um, And I think that was really hard because, like, I had some good ideas. I'm like, "Oh, this would be a good idea to add to the Littoral Commander system." And I did one of the things I did do was, like, I kept myself pretty disciplined of like, "Hey, I want this." The rule book is longer, I will say. If you look at the rule book, it's like 100 something pages. Don't freak out. It's not that big. People were complaining about like single text rule books and not being able to read, so we double space everything. All right, so like the normal 48 pages, like just essentially doubled. And we did add significant portions for the new mechanics. We added 2 sections. And the other additions that made the rulebook a little bit longer was that we gave a lot more examples, especially for JCCs, like for like complex JCCs, especially fighter nullifying, which is one thing that like tripped up a lot of people. So we gave a lot more examples, like really complex examples. Like I think I gave like 6 or 8 examples of like play by play of like this is the cars that happen and this is what will happen, right? And it will help people out. But in terms of mechanics, we only added the space mechanic, and disembarkation and the core action associated with those types of units. Um, we didn't really add anything else in terms of just clarifying some of the edges of those rules. Um, and then I would say we did add a portion where we call optional rules or advanced rules where you can be like, hey, these are things that other people really enjoyed when we were playtesting, but I didn't want to include them into the base rule set. But if you're interested, here are how these mechanics work. There's like an advanced submarine rule. There's a naval gunnery rule. People always ask like, what happens when my ship runs out of like missiles? I was like, well, you can use 5-inch guns, and this is how it works, right? So I don't recommend it. Right? So stuff like that. We added some portions, and we added a rule set for the interoperability network card, which works between nations for the upcoming national expansions. But that is something that's anticipatory versus like what you get in the box. Um, let's see.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, I have the one last question for me. Just if anyone has any question, just write me in the chat. Have you received any offer to release an Spanish version?
Not to my knowledge. Not that I know of.
Okay, because well, it's a game that well, it's a really a relatively just complex game if you don't dominate English because it's really
Yeah,
text dependent. It's not only the
yeah,
rule book; it's just you had your cards and so on. So it could be nice if any
yeah.
publisher
I
in
would love
Spanish does it.
a
So
Spanish publisher to
good,
work on it.
good to know. Okay,
So if you guys
people.
have recommendations, let me know.
Okay, I will let you know. Okay, people in the public, any last question? There is no. Okay, well, Sebastian, again, really thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure to have you here. I hope you, if you come to Spain, I hope you to see just around in any convention, physical convention. So if you're planning to come around, just let us know, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love that. People keep telling me I have to come to Spain, and it's been
Yes,
too long since I've come to Spain, so
it's
I
perfect.
agree. All right,
Okay,
thank you, everyone.
thank you, Sebastian. Bye bye.